There is something strange about watching an old commercial you may have seen dozens of times as a kid. Sometimes the product brings everything back. The kitchen, the television set, the smell of the store, even the sound of the announcer. And then you actually listen to what they were saying. That is when nostalgia can turn into disbelief very quickly. Some of these commercials are uncomfortable now. Some are unintentionally hilarious. And every once in a while, buried underneath the outdated sales pitch, there is an idea that was actually pretty clever. So rather than simply asking whether these commercials aged badly, listen for something else. What do you remember? What can you not believe they actually said? And which products do you secretly wish were still made the same way? 1. Maxwell House. Be a good little Maxwell housewife. There is one sentence in this commercial that seems to stop modern viewers cold. Be a good little Maxwell housewife. Not because the meaning is difficult to understand, because it is delivered so casually. That may be the biggest difference between watching these commercials now and remembering them from childhood. As kids, many viewers probably absorb the product, the jingle, and the familiar kitchen without thinking twice about the conversation surrounding it. Now the line jumps straight out of the television. And, judging by how often people repeat it, this might be one of the most memorable phrases in the entire collection. The funny part is that Maxwell House probably wanted viewers to remember good to the last drop. Instead, decades later, a lot of people remember the husband telling his wife exactly what her job was. Apparently good coffee was important. But apparently knowing your place was part of the recipe too. 2. Kentile, vinyl asbestos floor tile. This commercial has one of the greatest accidental plot twists in vintage advertising. You see the woman installing the floor and immediately think you know what the badly aged part is going to be. Then the announcer says the words, vinyl asbestos tile. And suddenly the sexism is competing for second place. That is exactly why this one gets such a strong reaction today. For people who grew up in houses, schools, and public buildings from this era, asbestos is not some abstract historical term. Some viewers remember those tiles. Some remember walking on them every day. Others remember buildings being closed years later, so crews could remove them safely. And yet here it is, being advertised as the smart, convenient choice for the woman installing her own kitchen floor. There is something almost perfect about that collision. One commercial manages to preserve an outdated social attitude and an outdated building material at exactly the same time. That is a real-time capsule. 3. Tab. Be a mind sticker. Of all the advertising phrases in this collection, be a mind sticker may be the hardest to forget, and not necessarily in the way Tab intended. There is something almost hypnotic about the commercial telling a woman that when she is not around, her shape should remain stuck in a man's mind. For viewers who actually grew up drinking Tab, the contrast is especially strange. The can itself may bring back perfectly normal memories. A mother drinking one at lunch, a refrigerator full of diet soda, that unmistakable Tab taste. Then you hear the old commercial again. Keeping your shape in shape has its rewards. That sounds very different when you are hearing it 50 years later. This is one of those ads where the product may still feel nostalgic, but the sales pressure surrounding it feels almost eerie. Tab wanted to sell diet soda. What it really preserved for us was a snapshot of how aggressively women were told that being remembered meant being thin. 4. Jell-O, the Chinese baby commercial. There are commercials that make you wonder whether people really talked that way. And then there are commercials that make you wonder how an entire room full of adults approved the script. This is the second kind. The part modern viewers seem to get stuck on is not even the product. It is the idea that the joke somehow requires a Chinese baby, exaggerated speech, and then the suggestion that a spoon is some kind of great Western invention. That last part is almost impossible to process now. And yet for people who grew up in this era, Jell-O itself can still trigger incredibly ordinary memories. Bowls in the refrigerator, family dinners, school lunches, and brightly colored desserts that showed up every week. That contrast is what makes the commercial interesting. The product is almost aggressively wholesome. The advertising wrapped around it feels completely foreign now. You can remember loving Jell-O and still watch this commercial thinking, Who exactly was this joke supposed to be for? 5.07. License to Kill Women. This commercial has one of the best delayed reactions in the entire collection. At first, there is almost nothing to object to. James Bond, aftershave, cologne, a gift set. Fine. Then the announcer reaches the phrase, "A license to kill women," and that is usually the moment people stop and say, "Wait, what?" That sudden turn is what makes the ad work so well in a compilation like this. It does not begin by warning you that something outrageous is coming. It sounds completely normal right up until it does not. And there is another layer of nostalgia here too. The 007 image once had enough cultural power to sell almost anything. Put the number on a grooming set, add some spy language, and suddenly ordinary aftershave became equipment for a mission. Smell like a secret agent is harmless enough. License to Kill Women is another matter. Some advertising lines become classics. Others survive mainly because nobody can believe they were broadcast. 6. Folgers. So's your coffee. Sometimes you do not need to explain why a commercial aged badly. You just need to repeat one exchange. That's pretty harsh. Well, so's your coffee. That line may have done more to keep this commercial alive than anything the coffee company actually wanted to sell. People still quote it because the delivery is so brutally clean. No hesitation, no apology. Just a husband informing his wife that her coffee is apparently bad enough to threaten domestic peace. The larger running joke across these old coffee commercials is how incredibly serious everyone appears to be about the subject. A bad cup is not a minor inconvenience. It is a crisis. And then comes the strangest part for modern coffee drinkers. The miracle solution is instant coffee. For anyone who remembers percolators, stovetop coffee, and the explosion of instant brands, maybe that pitch made more sense at the time. But today, the commercial feels like a marriage counselor sponsored by Folgers. 7. Goodyear Double Eagle. The tire inside a tire. Here is a commercial where the advertising message aged badly, but the engineering idea still makes people lean forward. Forget the line about a flat tire needing a man for a moment. A tire carrying its own safety spare inside? That actually sounds pretty clever. And that is why this one produces a different reaction from many of the others. People laugh at the assumption that a woman stranded with a flat is automatically helpless. But then they immediately ask some version of, "Why don't we still have that?" That is a useful reminder when looking at old advertising. Not everything old was foolish. Sometimes the product was genuinely interesting, while the copywriter chose the most dated possible way to sell it. The commercial almost becomes two different historical artifacts at once. One part shows how advertisers thought about women drivers. The other shows an era when tire companies were experimenting with safety ideas that still sound appealing decades later. Bad pitch. Interesting technology. 8. Xerox 914. 7 copies a minute. Today that sounds almost adorable. In this commercial, it sounds like the future has arrived. That is what makes the Xerox 914 such a good break from the rest of the collection. Yes, there is plenty to unpack about the secretary role. But a lot of viewers are more fascinated by how exciting the machine itself once seemed. Push a button. Turn a knob. Copy something onto ordinary paper. No wet chemical process. For an office worker at the time, that really was a transformation. And people remember that. Some viewers even have family stories about Xerox being dismissed as a fad before becoming one of the most recognizable names in office technology. That is the kind of historical irony you cannot manufacture. We laugh at 7 copies a minute because our printers are faster. But people watching this commercial originally were seeing a machine change office work in front of them. Sometimes old advertising does not just sell a product. It records the moment something ordinary today still looked like magic. 9. Burger King. The Vanishing American Hamburger. This commercial produces two completely different kinds of nostalgia. One is uncomfortable. The other smells like flame-broiled hamburgers. A lot of viewers immediately react to the Vanishing American character and the stereotype built into the joke. especially that single "how." It catches people completely off guard. But older viewers also start talking about Burger King itself. The smell when you walked inside, the flames under the broiler, the thick patties, the old Whopper, even the Whaler fish sandwich. That is why this one should not be reduced to only what aged badly. For some people, the footage is a direct line back to what Burger King actually felt like when they were young. And then there is the strange modern irony. The commercial jokes about hamburgers becoming smaller and smaller. Decades later, viewers hear that and immediately think of shrinkflation. So perhaps one part of the commercial aged better than Burger King intended. 10. Maxwell House, Paul, Lynde, and Alice. For many viewers, the coffee is not the reason this commercial survives. Paul Lynde is. The voice. The expression. That unmistakable grin. Some people watch the scene now and find him hilarious. Others think he looks like he wandered in from a horror movie. Both reactions are understandable. What makes the commercial especially strange in hindsight is that the domestic setup is so conventional, while Lynde himself is anything but conventional. Older viewers recognize him immediately from television and remember exactly how distinctive his presence was. That recognition changes the whole commercial. Suddenly you are not really watching another generic husband complain about breakfast. You are watching Paul Lynde perform a version of that husband, with every strange pause and expression he can fit into 30 seconds. Some vintage commercials survive because of the slogan. Some survive because the product disappeared. This one survives because the actor is simply more memorable than the coffee. And honestly, Alice's pouring technique deserves its own mention. 11. Fresh deodorant. My boss still hasn't asked me to lunch. The line sounds almost normal until your brain catches up with it. My boss still hasn't asked me to lunch. And then the obvious question arrives. Why exactly was deodorant supposed to make that happen? That is the reaction this commercial keeps producing. Not anger, so much as confused laughter. Because underneath the simple deodorant pitch is a whole set of assumptions about women, work, attractiveness, and getting ahead in the office. Being noticed by your boss is treated almost like professional progress. Being invited to lunch sounds suspiciously like part of the reward. The funniest part is that the commercial itself eventually backs away from the promise. Fresh cannot guarantee that you will get ahead in business. It only keeps you fresh. Which is probably the most sensible sentence in the entire ad. That makes this one oddly self-aware. The premise is wild. But the product finally turns around and says, essentially, look, we are deodorant. We can only do so much. 12. Coca-Cola. No waistline worry. There is something deeply strange about hearing regular Coca-Cola discussed almost like a diet aid. No waistline worry with Coke. That line alone tells you how much advertising language changes. Modern viewers hear it and immediately start thinking about sugar. Older viewers may remember something else first. The little glass Coke bottle, the colder taste, and the way Coke from that period seemed different from what they buy today. That is where this commercial becomes more interesting than just a questionable health claim. It captures an era when portion size itself looked very different. The bottle on screen is not the giant serving people now associate with soda. So the calorie comparison may have sounded more convincing than it does when we imagine a modern bottle. Still, describing Coca-Cola as natural and wholesome, while selling it as something that helps control the waistline, is hard to hear without smiling. Some ads age slowly. That wording aged spectacularly. 13. Camaro. The resilient bumper. There is a point in this commercial where car people stop thinking about the stereotype and start worrying about the Camaro. Every impact hurts, especially if you love old muscle cars. And that may be the most entertaining part of watching it now. The original joke assumes everyone is worried because a woman is driving. Modern viewers are more likely to say, "Stop hitting that car." At the same time, the bumper itself inspires real nostalgia. There was a period when a bumper was expected to take an impact and still look like a bumper afterward. Seeing one flex and recover feels almost exotic compared with modern bodywork that can turn a small parking accident into a very expensive repair. So yes, the woman driver setup aged badly, but the commercial accidentally sells something else to today's viewer. The dream of a classic Camaro with a bumper you could actually bump. For some people, that part still works. 14. Liquid Prell. This is where nostalgia takes over. People do not just remember Prell. They remember playing with it. Some viewers recall making the same elaborate hair shapes shown in the commercial, using the thick shampoo lather. Others remember the fake pearls, the bottle, and even the smell. Those sensory memories are exactly why old commercials can be so powerful. You may not remember the year. You may not remember the program you were watching. But you remember what that shampoo felt like in your hands. Of course, watching the commercial now also means noticing how casually it turns different cultures and historical figures into costumes. That part lands differently. But unlike some commercials in this collection, the outdated imagery does not completely erase the affection people still have for the product. This is one of the ads where the audience reaction feels almost evenly split. That part would never be made today. And I can still remember exactly what Prell smelled like. That is nostalgia in its purest form. 15. Pillsbury Funny Face. Goofy Grape is where people relax. Then the other names start arriving. And you can almost feel modern viewers slowly realizing why this commercial made the compilation. That delay is what makes Funny Face so effective. For many people, the product itself is pure childhood. They remember the packets. They remember mixing the drink. Some remember asking for Funny Face before they were old enough to remember the actual commercial. So the nostalgia is genuine. Then you hear names that sound much less innocent today, and suddenly, you are reminded that children's advertising was not somehow protected from the stereotypes common everywhere else. In fact, it often packaged them as brightly colored cartoon characters. That creates a strange emotional split. You can remember loving the drink without defending every piece of advertising built around it. And that is probably the healthiest way to look at a lot of this material. The childhood memory can be real. So can the discomfort. That may be what makes old commercials more interesting than ordinary old television. They were never meant to become history. They were supposed to sell something, disappear, and be replaced by the next commercial. But decades later, they preserve things no history book could capture quite the same way. The language, the expectations, the products people actually used, and the tiny details that suddenly unlock a memory you had forgotten you still had. So which one took you back immediately? And which line made you stop and think, I cannot believe they actually said that on television?